And 3, we are now recording.
Hello again, welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. One of the things that is fascinating about the UK at the moment is that we're going through a very, very curious time of extremely hot weather. The heat is actually bringing out some very, very interesting things in people because we're actually becoming more outdoor orientated. And indeed, I was in London yesterday and it was absolutely amazing the way in which there's this general feeling of positivity around us, which is really, really nice. We've been just discussing before we started the program about temperatures and how warm it is. And my producer, Dia, over there in Denver was saying about how ridiculously hot it was over in Denver. And she mentioned 111 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, that is a ridiculous amount. And my mind just boggles about that. It really does. Today's guest is somebody that I've probably known now for about 3 or 4 years. I know him as two guises. I know him as the private individual, and I also know him as a very erudite science fiction come science fantasy writer by the name of Martin Ash. And we're going to be interviewing Martin in his incarnation of Martin Ash rather than the private individual I know. Martin had been for a long time telling me that I needed to pick up some of his books and read them. But because I get a lot of people saying, you know, you must read my books, I never get round to them. And with Martin's books, this was rather the case, rather because I was busy and everything else, so I didn't get around to doing them. But around about 4 or 5 months ago, I picked up a series of books that he's written called The Orbs World. And I have, sorry?
Enchantment's Reach.
Enchantment's Reach, sorry, yeah, I had a bit of a blank there in terms of the title. And I have to say that it gripped me from the start. And there are 6 books in the series, and they seem to really go by so quickly, and you read them so quickly because the characterization is profoundly effective. And considering that Martin deals with such a huge number of characters, and all of the characters have an element of mystery about them. So you're always intrigued as to what is the backstory to this character, what is really going on. And I think the only books that it reminds me of, I think, is probably the Stephen Donaldson books from the early 1980s, Lord Fowl's Bane and various other books. But these books are bigger written. There's almost elements of Mervyn Peake in here as well. And it has this wonderful underlying mystery, which I really, really enjoy. And today is my opportunity to really ask questions about the writing process, where these ideas come from, and indeed how a writer of such incredible imagination, where those ideas come from. So without further ado, Martin, what I'd like you to do is to explain a little bit, how did you become a writer and where do your ideas come from?
Well, that's a good question, a difficult one, really. I think I've always, as a child, I mean, I had a fairly solitary childhood. I wasn't an only child, but my older siblings were quite a lot older than me, and they left home quite early. We lived in a tiny village in the countryside in England. And I was kind of very much, my parents were very, very busy getting food on the table, keeping a roof over our heads. So I was left to my own devices a great deal. And I think my imagination just grew there through entertaining myself. And I don't know when exactly, I was always very fascinated by writing. At school, I excelled at school. I was always first or second in every class that in writing stories and essays in English language and literature. I wasn't that good at anything else particularly. I was fairly average, but when it came to English and writing, yeah, I did excel. I don't know that I ever thought about becoming a writer for a long time. To be honest, I was in awe of the writers that I read and was appreciated, whether that was the classics of Dickens and Dumas and Victor Hugo and the Brontes and people like that, or when I got to be a teenager, I used to devour science fiction and fantasy and horror. And again, I was just so in awe of many of these writers and novels that it didn't occur to me for a long time that possibly I could do something about myself. And then I went through a bit of a crisis in my early teenage years. I ended up getting thrown out of school, actually, and going off on a kind of a bit of a spiritual emergency of sort of having rejected my own culture to a large extent, and certainly the Christian ethos that I was brought up in, I felt I was being indoctrinated by. And I traveled a lot around Europe, just put my thumb in the air and saw, work out where it would take me. And in that process, I started writing. And it struck me at some point that maybe I could actually get something published. And I came back to England and I had a few short stories published. And I thought maybe I could even try a novel. And I think I did a couple that were hopelessly awful. Nobody would touch. And then eventually I had a novel published, and then a few more. And at that point, I hadn't thought about writing fantasy. It came much later when I was exploring. I'd always been exploring ideas of spirituality and myth, and trying to find out what we are, trying to understand what I was, because I've had quite a chaotic psyche that was causing me all kinds of problems. But I was always passionate about trying to work out, what am I? What are we in relation to this extraordinary, inexplicable universe that we find ourselves in? And what is our relationship to, and I'm always hesitant to use the G word of God because it automatically has associations with Judeo-Christian religion. And I sort of pulled myself out of that. But it's essentially, what is our relation with God? Or what the Gnostics term the pleroma, and the akasha, and the Jungian terms of collective unconscious. And I was fascinated by Sufism and Buddhism and Hinduism and all those isms. And I began to incorporate those into my books. And a point came where I'd sort of got a bit disillusioned with fantasy and science fiction. But then it just hit me that fantasy, the way I wanted to express my ideas, fantasy was the perfect vehicle to do that. I don't think of myself specifically as a fantasy writer, but I do use, as you've discovered, elements of myth and draw from spiritual and esoteric traditions to explore ideas of what we are. I mean, the characters essentially are on these journeys of self-transformation and self-exploration. And although the landscapes are very much wild, wonderful otherworld landscapes, they are very much also inner landscapes. They're kind of journeys into sort of unknown, unexplored or undiscovered territories of the mind and to self-realization. So that's kind of how I got really into fantasy. But it was a long, drawn-out process that it sort of just came about through a process of personal growth, I suppose.
It's fascinating because the way you write reminded me, and it'd be interesting for you to explain in a second who you considered your major influences to be. Because I was reminded a lot when reading your novels of kind of the Bildungsroman novels, the kind of the German novels, the kind of Narcissus and Goldmund, very Hermann Hesse, in the way which is, you rightly say there, and it really hit home, and it really helped me understand your writing style there, that it's the inner journey as well, because all your characters seem to be, it's very much a quest, isn't it? They're all on a quest, and they're all thrown into these circumstances. Now, so when you first, what were your first novels about? What themes did you follow in those then? Your initial ones from many years ago?
Metaphysical thrillers, but set very much in contemporary times. Well, one of them was a kind of a Cold War thriller that was set in London and Berlin, but it was very much a metaphysical kind of exploration of what are we doing in this, essentially this divided world that we occupied in Europe with the Iron Curtain, which seemed to be an extraordinary metaphor for the divided self, the human self. And I was studying Jung at the time, and that sort of influenced me greatly. And I read a lot of, and I still love Cold War espionage novels, Le Carré particularly, and Len Deighton. Robert Ludlum as well. What's his character? Very famous, got the spy, the CIA spy who's lost his memory. Jason Bourne. Those Bourne.
Oh yes, yes.
Which are pure thrillers, and they get dismissed very often as being just thrillers. But you know, he's really a character who has lost entirely his sense of self and is rebuilding a life, trying to discover who and what he is. Jason Bourne. So there's a lot of depth to that, despite the fact that they are page-turning political espionage thrillers. And I love that. I love those, and I tried to do something of the kind with a sort of metaphysical, essentially spy thriller. Didn't work too well, and the others were a bit too dark to have a sort of gain an audience. Sort of there was one I wrote that was really about the human race destroying itself, but I set it in at a birthday party in somebody's front room, where everybody was just so horrible, so dreadful to each other, that they all ended up throwing themselves off a balcony. And it was all done in a very mocking tone as well. I kind of invented a religion in the middle of it, and I used this godlike tone to just make fun of the characters, not out of me wanting to taunt them or anything, but just to question what the heck is this all about, because we do seem to be on this path, possibly an unconscious path, but to self-destruction. And we tend to be, human beings can be extraordinarily brutal, even in their everyday interactions. And I've always been very sensitive to that. And but yeah, I was writing these kind of books, but we're never going to find a large audience because they were just too harsh, really.
So, so when you start a novel of any description, really, do you know where you're going to go? Do you plan it, or does it just?
I don't. I just want to go back a second. You mentioned Hermann Hesse, and I'd forgotten Hesse, but yes, I read a lot of Hesse years ago, and now you mention it, absolutely, I would consider him to be quite a significant influence. But it's interesting, I'd totally forgotten his work. Planning, plotting, no. I remember reading a long time ago a writer, science fiction fantasy author, who was writing how to write lessons, really, in a magazine, and he was saying how it's important that you plan every chapter. You need to know what's going to happen. You map it out beforehand until you know what will happen at the end. And I was a bit astonished because I couldn't disagree more. To me, the writing process is all about finding out what the story is from the characters and from their situations. I have an approximate idea of where it may end up, but it's not fixed. I'm not wedded to that because I simply don't know. And the only thing I know, I mean, if you take Enchantment's Reach as an example, I had a couple of opening scenes and 3 or 4 characters. The opening scene, as you know, is an old lady attempting to murder a small child beside a pond deep in a forest. And don't want to give away any plot elements here, but she's interrupted by a stranger who just appears out of nowhere. And the reader, hopefully, is thinking, well, why does this woman want to murder the child? What's the significance of the child? And who is this mysterious stranger? And that was exactly my feelings. I didn't know. And I had to wait for them to explain themselves and tell me what it was all about, why they were doing this. And the same thing was, the next scene where we go into the city castle of Enchantment's Reach, where the 2 main characters, Issel and Leth, who are a married couple, who are king and queen of this sort of almost a fairy tale city castle. It's sort of a very isolated small land. And I went in there and I kind of knew that they're a couple very much in love and they're very benevolent rulers of their land, but they are deeply conflicted with conflict that's coming from outside, with impending war, and they don't understand why, but also there's an inner conflict within the city castle itself with these wayward religious cults coming up to the surface that have caused, they've been banned, most of them are forbidden, they've been causing untold problems. And also the characters themselves have got these inner conflicts going on, which are kind of projected, reflected on the outer world. And essentially that was really all I knew to begin with. So, and that's all I needed to know. It's the same with other novels. I never really know where they're going to go. But I just talk to the characters. I kind of question them quite deeply and say, look, what are you doing here? Tell me. And how did you get yourself into this situation? And what are you going to do about it? And what is your connection to this other character maybe over here? What is their connection to this event that happened back there? And is that linked to any of these other characters that are appearing? And little by little, the tale starts to assemble itself. And at times I can predict where it's going. And at other times it's just a revelation to me. And for me, that's the enjoyment. And I just can't imagine writing a book, because this is a 6-volume epic that took several years to write. Known exactly what was going to happen chapter by chapter and had a predicted ending. I can't think of anything really less interesting to spend my time doing. To me, it's a voyage of discovery. As for the characters, they're on a voyage of transformation. It's kind of a hero's journey into the unknown and investigating their place in this world and experiencing the numinous and the mysteries of life through conflict and betrayal and love and war and all sorts of things. And that's kind of how it all starts and slowly comes together.
Right, so it was actually a kind of an image you had. So a kind of an image came into your mind of the situation with the child and with the old woman. So it's kind of a spontaneous image, and from there you embarked upon it. Now you're writing, when you write, do you write when you feel inspired, or do you write religiously, do 6 hours a day?
Well, it's not a religiously, we stick to any amount of words religiously, but once I'm involved, I can't stop. I can't let it go. I can become completely consumed by it, and everything else drops away. And,
do you ever go back to rewrite sequences afterwards? You've already and you think, no, I need to rewrite history, as it were, to make that scenario work.
Oh no, nothing really that radical, but I do frequently go back. And before publishing, I went, because I'm an independent author these days, as you know, and before republishing them in the first place, I went through them entirely, but there were sort of cosmetic changes, but nothing radical. And I've never changed the history, because the history just sort of reveals itself to me as the characters discover it. So it's a strange process. It's a very, very absorbing process, and it's fascinating, because in a way I don't know how, and I think many writers, novelists will say the same thing. They don't know how the story comes together. It just seems as though it's almost as though you're channeling it from somewhere where it already exists, which is, to some people, might sound a bit far-fetched, but it does feel that way, that you are involved in the lives of these characters who somehow have an existence of their own.
That was the powerful thing, I think, of me reading Enchantment's Reach, was I really cared about the characters. And it's the love of the central characters, and a woman's love of her children.
Yeah.
As a male writer, I mean, I don't, obviously as a male myself, I don't necessarily, I can try and appreciate in ways I can, but you really write in this most wonderful way where, I remember once my sister turning round to me and saying that when she had her children, she'd never realized, and it's something you say, where you say, this being had grown in me, and it would come from me and grown within me, because there is a certain very, very wonderful, strange, godlike creature that is 1 in 3. And this creature clearly is all powerful, but cannot appreciate the mysteries of love, because the gods aren't triune. And there's this kind of discussion between the female lead character and Tryon just cannot understand this strange love she has for her children. And, you know, you've sensed this, she would kill for her children. And it's so well drawn and it's so well drawn. Well, I don't want to ruin the book for everybody. All I can say is that really, really read it. Now, what I'd like to do is just focus in on 2 or 3 of the sections that I think probably, because they won't give the plot away, but to me were particularly powerful. And as I said earlier, great books are books where you remember exactly where you were where the incident took place. I'm reminded, for instance, of probably the greatest incident in a book I've ever come across was in John Fowles' book, The Magas, where you discover that one of the characters has committed suicide. And again, I won't ruin the book, but I remember I was on the number 77 bus in 1980, 79, coming out of Rains Park Station. And I know exactly even where I was sitting on the bus when this announcement happened. It was so profound. I wanted to turn around to everybody on the bus and say, guess what John Fowles has just done? And it was the same with your book. And there were 2 or 3 sections, I think, that really hit me. And one of them that I think we could just discuss slightly is this image you have of this plain full of statues. So if you can explain your philosophy behind that, because it was one of the most disturbing things I've ever read. It really played on my mind all night afterwards. It played on my mind.
Good.
So if you can explain that, what you were trying to convey with that.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm delighted that you've enjoyed it all, and I was a bit nervous when I knew you were reading it. I know you read a lot, and you've got high standards, so it didn't. I'm very, very pleased you enjoyed it. Yeah, that particular scene is horrific. And it came to me, well, actually, I'll tell you the first inspiration for that was, do you know the work of Anthony Gormley, the sculptor?
Yes.
Know, these metal figures.
The ones they've got on the beach in Formby.
Yeah.
There's another place.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
He had them on the city buildings in London a while ago.
Yeah.
Places all over the natural landscape. Anthony, I've lost touch with him, but he used to be a neighbour. He used to live directly across the road from me many years ago. And I didn't know his work until I knew him. And we would chat from time to time. We had children, our daughters were the same age, so we would sort of, sometimes he and his family, or I and my family, when I was married, would sort of get together from time to time, mainly dealing with the children. And I was fascinated by his work because these figures he creates are these powerful, almost featureless metal figures that are molded around his own body, and then he places them in the landscapes all around the world, and they just gaze out onto the world. And I was really struck by this, and talking to him about it, I was very struck by it. And then as I was writing the novel, I just had this idea, which was based on those figures, of what was called, what I call this plane of imprisoned souls, where people, because as you know, in that part of the book, Leth has entered what was called Orbelon's world, and he's trying to understand what this world is all about. And Orbelon, who seems to have created the world but doesn't know it, is also trying to discover what his world is. And these people, the inhabitants of this world, are pleading for what they consider their god. They believe the god has abandoned them, and they're living in absolute despair. Or many of them are trying to bring this god back, and a certain number of them have chosen this rather extreme way of incarcerating themselves in these metal figures, and they've placed themselves out in this isolated plane where they just plead for their god to return to bring salvation until they die, because God doesn't come, and so they're lost. They've chosen to make martyrs of themselves in a way. And I think we all know in our own world, because of course this Enchantment's Reach is set in another world, but it's essentially an analogue of our own world. It's reflecting our own world in many ways. And we all know that the extremes that people will go to in terms of religious fanaticism and religious belief. And this was obviously a terrible extreme. And it was disturbing writing it, I have to say. It gave me nightmares because it's such a shocking scene, and they revisit it a couple of times. But there's one scene particularly where Leth and the companion, he's with Lake Wonder, and they stumble on it. Well, for him, it's the first time, and he tries to help he tries to help two of these characters, and both of them reject him utterly, even though they're in absolute agonies of suffering. They will not accept any kind of assistance from anyone because they believe that they have to, through their actions, they're going to have the god return to them. So yeah, the initial inspiration was from the work of Anthony Gormley, who was a great sculptor. But I mean, I just extended that into my own kind of interpretation, or misinterpretation, really. It's not related to his work entirely, but I just saw the potential there, given that the book is about, the series is very much about people one way or another trying to discover meaning and bring a spiritual value and a sense of the creator into their lives. And these poor characters in utter desperation have done this, but end up suffering horribly until they perish.
Funnily enough, I would suggest if anybody is interested in this, if you go onto Google and just look up The Other Place, you will see exactly what Martin is describing here, because outside of my home area of Liverpool, there is huge beaches, and there's this beach area where they've just placed lots of these figures that are just staring out into space, into the beach. And remarkable. And obviously I should have seen that link, actually. I mean, maybe I did subliminally. The link I made initially was in Philip K. Dick's novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. There was a sequence where there is a sub-story which doesn't appear in the movie Blade Runner, where there is a belief system called Mercerism. And Mercerism is about having empathy with somebody who has stones thrown at them and everything else. And I was reminded slightly of that. And then again, it reminded me of St. Simon Stylites, who was a guy where he was on the top of the pole in Asia Minor, and he wanted to isolate himself. So there was these kind of powerful images of monasticism and asceticism and everything else, which you got across so powerfully. You really did, But there are other sections where there's great humour, and sections where you clearly were having great fun. And there's that section where there is this guy in a castle who is effectively two people symbiotically together. If you just quickly explain the influence of that one, and then we'll move on, because that was quite funny. I laughed out loud at that.
Yeah, I loved that scene. I'm going to try to describe it without giving it away. That is the giant Serb two heads who has this castle called Ardbaya Keep, which the characters that are involved at that time are in this descending into this region called the Death Abyss, with Leth at the helm, but he's very reluctantly been engaged with this group of utterly villainous characters because he's trying to rescue his children who are incarcerated somewhere within the bowels of the Death Abyss. And of course, this is again a sort of a journey into the chthonic, the underworld of myth and magic. It's a very common theme. And they have to pass through this Ardbaya Keep, which is inhabited by this giant with two heads, who I don't know where that came from. I mean, I call him Serb because I was vaguely thinking of Cerberus, the three-headed dog.
That's what I thought, yeah.
Only a very slight link there. It's also very, I mean, the world is very steeped in, Eastern and European myth and fairy tale and elements of that kind, the folklore. And I think that kind of figure comes up in ancient myths and folklore. I mean, I don't have a direct link. I don't know exactly where he came from, but I also was just intrigued by the idea of this sort of very schizoid sort of character who's totally in two minds as to what to do, how to go about it. And it's like a bickering couple as well. Just constantly, the one wants to do one thing and the other one wants to do another thing, but they're bound together, in this case literally physically bound together, and they've got no choice but to to settle the argument by either one of them agreeing to do what the other is, or well, again, I'm not going to give anything away, but he gets into this tremendous argument with himself because he cannot agree about what to do next, whether to basically accompany this Leth and this group of villains down into the death abyss on an adventure and a quest, or whether to stay home and sit in front of the fire. And as you know, it resolves itself in a fairly dramatic way.
Yes, we won't ruin it any more than that, because the reader really needs to enjoy that sequence.
But it was great fun to write, I have to say, and I still chortle over it myself.
I mean, knowing you, I just visualize. And I think that's the wonderful thing when you're reading a book, when you know the novelist. I can just visualize you chortling away to yourself as you're writing that sequence, because the rest of it is quite depressing in places, and this is just a shining light of a bit of fun where you think, oh no, that was actually quite nice, but we're going back to the depressing stuff again.
Yeah, I mean, you need a little light relief from time to time, but at the same time, it's a very dark episode, but it's just extremely funny. It's sort of grand guignol, really, isn't it?
It is, totally. Almost Monty Python's The Holy Grail, that kind of elements as well.
Yeah.
But now your latest work, I mean, I've not read any of your latest work at all, but you have a major project on now about sort of series of about shamanism, I think, as I understand it.
It is. It's there are 3 standalone novels at the moment called, which I've published, called, well, collectively known as called the Chronicles of the Shaman. The 3 novels are called MOONBLOOD, Heart of Shadows, and Citadel, and they are set in, well, actually there are links to the world of Enchantment's Reach, very, very vague links, but there are nods to certain events and characters so you feel that you might be in the same world. But in the world of Enchantment's Reach, as you know, the world is never the world is not named, because it's just is this internal, the psyche, seeking the universal soul, really is the underlying theme. And at the same time, in the Chronicles of the Shaman, at present the world is not named, so you're left, if the reader has read the other books, they're left wondering, is this the same or is it not? They are 3 standalone novels, let's say, which all of them involve, to a greater or lesser extent, a character called Rombas Dimbig, who is a shamanistic spy sleuth, well, a reluctant sleuth and a merchant from a land called Kimur. And he's a fairly, well, actually at the beginning, he's a fairly new initiate to what's called the Zankassin order, who are a sort of shamanistic or spiritual order who are able to leave their bodies and travel into these non-corporeal realms of existence and bring back information and knowledge about the greater universe. And in doing so, well, talking about Rombas Dimbig himself, he has to first of all tame a spirit ally who will take charge of his body whilst he's away investigating the realms, so that his body is not taken over by other spirits, other entities. And he has he's tamed this character called Yo, who basically has a rather boring job of just sitting inside Rombas Dimbig's body whilst Rombas Dimbig is away. But the trade-off is that Yo, little by little, is going to be introduced to our world, our material world, and the deal is that he, at some point, Dimbig will find an animal body for Yo to occupy so that he can explore the world on his own. But at the same time, he always has to be alert to summon so that he can guard Dimbig's body while Dimbig's away. So they, that's the basis of all 3 novels. The underlying theme there is the kind of hidden history of religion, because all of them, as I say, they're completely separate stories, but they all in their own way uncover a deliberately buried history of religious and spiritual belief, which is the transition that our world underwent many centuries ago, the transition from goddess worship into the patrilinear male god that has been dominant for 4,000 years or more now. And I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but there are many writers who've written in our world about the former goddess religions and how this came about, and we ended up with the patrilinear system. And I feel that's a very important thing to investigate, and I'm able to explore it through this fantasy world. So to some extent, the novels explore that and how history has been, the history of the people in the books now have been influenced, or the history has been influenced by these hidden events that slowly become uncovered, and then effectively changes the nature of the world that they live in. It's also very, very based on fairy tale and myth. And then the last one, Citadel, is totally about, the whole world is complete metaphor. I mean, Dinbig is obliged to investigate his own death because he discovers he's been executed in this other world, other city, which is in the land of, the land of Anxau. That's the city of doubt, which is basically all these psychological things we go through: anxiety and angst and doubt. And so there are 3 crazed warlords vying for power there, and one of them has executed Rombas Dinbig. We don't know why, and Dinbig doesn't know why, because as far as he's concerned, he hasn't been executed. So he's set on this quest to discover, how is it that I'm keeping getting information that I'm no longer alive, and suffered a really horrible death. And within the city of doubt, as he's investigating this, he discovers this mythical, otherworldly place called the Citadel of Self. It's spelled S-E-L-P-H, but obviously it's a homophone. And he's forced to, basically, he finds himself under the influence of an extremely powerful root drug, a sacred drug. He finds himself unwillingly being taken deep into the Citadel itself. But of course, it ends up, again, I'm not going to give things away, but it is about the revelations that one can discover if we go deeply into our own psyche. And that's going to, those 3 are going to lead into a series that I'm currently putting together. And I don't have well, I do have a title, but I don't want to reveal it yet, and it may not be the actual title, which will turn into, I think, another 5 or 6 volumes that won't be dependent upon the 3. It will be helpful for the reader if they have read the 3 preceding novels, but it kind of will continue exploring these otherworldly, ethereal realms of non-corporeality. Because, I mean, people often tend to think, when I'm exploring this, that these are just pure fantasy, but they're not. If you know anything about shamanism and related practices, it is possible through various means, whether it's through mind-altering substances or through deep meditation, through dance and trance, through holotropic breathing techniques, or whatever. There are many ways that we can access this greater self that is something that transcends the everyday functional self that we use, that we're imprisoned in, really, as we live in the world, the material world that we are in.
Well, that leads us beautifully, doesn't it, to the next section of our discussion.
I thought I said that.
Yeah, it's perfect. I thought, what a wonderful segue there. He's managed to do that without even my help. Because one of the reasons that we became friendly was because we both have a mutual interest in altered states of consciousness and the implications of altered states of consciousness. And we have both been together to an event that happens every 2 years at the University of Greenwich called Breaking Convention. And this is a conference where it discusses, among many things, substances such as dimethyltryptamine and 5-MeO-DMT. And it was one of the areas we had some fascinating discussions on this. Now, as we both will stress quite strongly, these substances are prescribed substances within the UK, and they are prescribed substances within most of Western Europe and the United States and Canada. But there are
proscribed, should emphasize, not prescribed.
Oh, proscribed, yes. Yeah, absolutely. It must be the heat. Must be the heat. maybe that was a subliminal.
People don't think they can just go to the doctor and get
Yes, that is true. Prescribed drugs. Not again. But effectively here we have something of an area of interest, and I know that you have been far more adventurous, let's say, in terms of your own interest in these substances and your own psychonautic tendencies. So could you tell us a little bit about your experiences in Latin America, and specifically your experiences that you had last year with 5-MeO? So the floor is yours now to explain as you see fit what happened.
Sure. I think I'll start with ayahuasca, which, as you know, the psychoactive ingredient of ayahuasca is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. I was kind of vaguely aware of ayahuasca many years ago, but it was something that was far away in the jungles of South America, and it wasn't practical to ever be able to go there. I wasn't a William Burroughs who went cavorting around searching for it. And don't know if you ever read his letters to Allen Ginsberg, where he just went charging off into Colombia and elsewhere when, this is long before we had the internet and communications of today, but decided he had to find out about ayahuasca and somehow survived. But I'm not quite that reckless. But I guess about 6 or 7 years ago, I read a couple of books that had a profound effect on me. One was, which I know you've read as well, Jeremy Narby's The Cosmic Serpent. And the other was not Rick Wakeman.
Right. Tales of Topographic Oceans, maybe.
Rick Strassman's DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And both of those books, I mean, should I explain them at all? Or?
Very, very quickly, yeah, it would be useful, I think.
I mean, Jeremy Narby is an anthropologist who spent time in the rainforests of Peru with the Ashaninka tribe, I think, trying to, just doing what anthropologists do to understand their traditions and culture. But he discovered that they were regularly drinking this very intoxicating brew called ayahuasca. And as an anthropologist, a scientist, he had to stand back. You observe and you don't participate. But at a certain point, he was so struck by the visions that these people were having and the way that the ayahuasca in this shamanic culture was influencing their lives, that he decided he had to break with Western tradition and experience it himself. And it was he did, and it was a life-changing experience for him. And he wrote this wonderful book called The Cosmic Serpent, in which, if anybody's interested, they can read it. It's very scientific. It's not an easy read, but it's a very profound read. That affected me a great deal. And then Rick Strassman is a psychologist in New Mexico, I think.
The University of New Mexico. Yeah.
Who got permission to run trials on human subjects, volunteers, with DMT, which is the pure psychoactive ingredient of ayahuasca, and had extraordinary responses from them, where none of them met each other or knew each other, but they would be taken into this vast other world, this other dimension, where they would very often encounter entities or have experiences that had a lot of commonality. The fact that he was struck, I think, largely by the fact that these people reported very, very similar experiences, even though they had never spoken to each other or exchanged information. And he wrote this book called The DMT, the Spirit Molecule. So I read these and I was just absolutely enthralled. I just thought, I have to know what this is all about. I can't just sit here and be an armchair expert and not have the experience for myself. And I'm not a recreational drug user, and these are not recreational drugs. As you said earlier, they're very, very powerful substances, and they should be treated with great respect and in traditional societies with great reverence. I mean, they're taken in or ayahuasca is drunk in a very ceremonial setting amongst traditional shamanic societies. Actually, shamanic is something of a misnomer, because it's an umbrella term that comes from the Tungus region in Siberia. I think it's been used to describe all kind of traditional societies that use plant medicines, sacred plant medicines. In Peru, where I went first to Brazil and then Peru and later Mexico. In Peru, depending upon the substances, the plants they use, they'll either be called the so-called shaman, will be termed an ayahuasquero or a curandero or vegetalista. I think in Colombia it's a tainta or something, I'm not exactly sure. But these substances have been used for centuries, possibly millennia, by these traditional indigenous communities. So I thought, well, I started then reading Terence McKenna as well, who was the great psychonaut of our times, really. And I have got to find out what this really is about. I cannot, I was getting really itchy, restless, because I just could not just intellectualize it and be satisfied with that. The problem then was, where do I go? Because they're not legal, as you've already said, in this country or in many other countries. So I had to go off to places where they were legal. And then there's a phenomenon that's become known as ayahuasca tourism in South America these days, where people are going seeking spiritual salvation through these the use of these visionary plant medicines. And so some people are suffering. I mean, there are plenty of opportunists out there who, pop-up shamans who will sort of grab you as you walk into you get off the boat on the Amazon and tell you, oh, my brother is a shaman and he's got this, or they'll sell it to you on the street, and you have to be very wary. So I did a lot of research for several months. Thanks to the internet, I was able to make contacts that 20 years ago would have been impossible to make. And I watched a lot of videos, read a lot of reports online, and bought numerous books and so forth. And eventually I was invited out to the home of a very highly respected ayahuasquero in Brazil, who prefers to remain anonymous. And I was delighted to go there because I'd read some of his work and I was very impressed by his approach. And he said, well, if you really want to know, you're very welcome to come and join us. He went to home from time to time, where groups of people go. And he also has luminaries from the world of the arts and literature and science who also give presentations in the time that you're there. So I took the plunge and went out there. And there's a story I'd like to tell, actually, about the benefits that ayahuasca can bring, because it's a very, very strange substance. When you drink it, first of all, it tastes disgusting. It's absolutely horrible. Can't even describe how horrible it is. And everybody has the same reaction. The first time you drink it, it's not so awful. But every time after that, it just gets worse and worse. And even people who've been drinking it for decades cannot bear the taste. It is foul. And usually, sometime after you've drunk it, you vomit. You projectile vomit. You're always given a little bucket to vomit into. It's a great leveler to meet with strangers and drink ayahuasca and then all vomit together. But then there are very many different effects it can have. One of them being that it can seem that sometimes it might seem that nothing's happening. Experts will tell you that things are still happening, it's still working, but that you're just not perceiving it. You can have, at times, extraordinary cosmic transcendental visions that are just so wonderful, sort of spiritual realization of essentially the vastness of the self, of just how limited we are in our perceptions of the world with this little brain that's filtering information just so that we can function in the everyday world. And it seems that when you drink ayahuasca, it opens the attenuator, the reducing valve, and expands your consciousness into this other realm of existence, which is a very real realm. It's a place where it's opening the doors of perception, of Aldous Huxley's term, which you're very familiar with, that can give you an extraordinary experience of what we are beyond being just little bags of flesh and bone and gooey liquids and so forth that we stumble around the world in trying to make sense of. It can also take you deep into your buried memories, unconscious traumatic memories, and bring those forth and release them. And story I would just want to briefly tell is a couple I met, an American couple who I met in Brazil, who were on the same retreat as me, have become good friends since then. And I didn't know at the time, but they were there because they were going through a very difficult phase in their marriage. Their marriage was virtually on the rocks. And I've asked their permission to tell this story, by the way. I'm not breaking any confidences, but I won't name names. And the reason that they were having such difficulties were mainly because the husband, and I'll call him Jake. He'll love that. Hey, Jake, how you doing? Had terrible addiction problems with alcohol. He's an alcoholic, and with crystal meth, which I'm sure you know is a terrible opiate, a terrible substance to be involved with. And his addictions were breaking up their family. They had 2 teenage children. They'd been together many years. They obviously loved each other, but they were on their last legs, really. This was their last hope to save their marriage. And this wasn't obvious at the time. It was plain that he had problems, but that I didn't know all the details. It was only, we met again in Mexico last year, and it all came out. He went through some very difficult experiences with the first 3 ceremonies we did with the ayahuasca, and was in quite a bad way. As it happened, the retreat was extremely well organized. We had 2 very experienced psychologists there. One of them had trained for years with Stanislav Grof, and the other one has many decades of experience in America with psychedelic therapy, working with people suffering from depression and PTSD and other mental afflictions. And the 2 of them, which Jake told me last year about, I didn't know exactly, but they sat down with him because he didn't want to do any more ayahuasca. He felt nothing was working. It was an absolutely desperate state. But the 2 of them sat down with him, spent hours with him, both together and separately, to try and work through get to the roots of his problems. And he eventually decided he would do the last ceremony, and he drank the ayahuasca. And then what he told me last year when we met, because I asked, because it was plain after that there'd been an improvement. I could see that something had broken through for him, and he'd found something. I asked them both what happened last year when we met last year. And he said he took joined us in the final ceremony, drank the ayahuasca, and when the visions came, he found himself in this empty, dark space where there was nothing but a huge rope tied in knots. He had no idea what that was, why it was there, and there was nothing else. That was it. So he thought, well, there's nothing else to do. I'll start to work to undo these knots. And as he worked to unravel the first knot, he realized he was reliving a trauma from the past that was fundamental to his addictions, his addictive personality. As he released it, it came into consciousness and it blew away. It was no longer an unconscious urge that was directing his life. And as he went through each of the knots, he went through a further trauma, one by one, until he'd unraveled the entire rope and was essentially free of all the traumas that had been destroying his and his family's life for many years. And I thought that was so a beautiful story and so moving and so indicative of the benefits that these substances can have if used responsibly in the correct mindset, i.e. and this correct setting where you know you're secure and you're in safe hands and you've got people who can look after you and who can guide you through this. And essentially, yes, it saved their marriage, and they are eternally grateful for having done that. And this is where there's no doubt that these substances, there are others such as psilocybin, commonly known as magic mushrooms, which again are illegal. I've been working or meeting lately with researchers from Imperial College London, who are they've been conducting trials with psilocybin to treat post-traumatic stress disorders, depression, anxiety, OCD, and other related afflictions, and have had to date very, very encouraging results. And they are campaigning. There is a campaign online that maybe we can, I don't know the address, but we could possibly append it on this when it goes online for people to sign, because we're trying to encourage the authorities to recognize the potential value of these substances, to legalize them for medicinal purposes and research. And this team is headed by Professor David Nutt, who I think you're familiar with, and it's under the team itself, underneath the direction of Dr. Rosalind Watts, and they're doing tremendous work. Very, very dedicated, trained professional psychologists and researchers who are really working to where the common antidepressants and anti-anxiety pharmaceuticals don't work. The SSRIs generally just don't work or cause side effects. And we're finding, research is finding that many of these things like DMT and psilocybin can have hugely beneficial results. And there's research going on all over the world with Dr. Bill Richards, with Dr. William Richards' team in Johns Hopkins Medical University, who've been working with these substances as well for many years. And it's really something that we need to be more aware of, but equally aware of the risks, because taken irresponsibly, this is very, very powerful stuff that can cause tremendous problems if you think of it in any way as a recreational drug. So we need to find ourselves in a society where these things can be prescribed and used for the benefit of people who are suffering, but we need to do that with great responsibility and say respect for what these substances are.
Okay.
So that's, yeah, I don't know, do you have any more questions on that?
No, so that was very well put together and wonderful story, and clearly, it shows how the symbolism works in these things. Now, one of the previous guests on this in this podcast was Dr. Martin Ball, who we both know of. We both saw speak, I think, at a Breaking Convention 3 years ago. Now, your experiences that you've had, we've got another 5 minutes or so to run through. Your own experiences with 5-MeO-DMT. I know when you came back and we met up at the National Gallery, you were really amazed. I've never seen anybody that was just so amazed at what you'd experienced. Can you just touch upon very quickly in a very short amount of time what you experienced on there?
I'll try. 5-MeO is it's the boss. It's the one that transports you virtually instantly out of this world, a complete dissolution of the ego, complete dissolution of the physical and even the conscious universe into, and to anyone who's doesn't know anything about this, it probably sounds absurd, but you are catapulted warp speed into the reality behind this, the reality of this world, which the Kabbalists call the Ein Sof, and the quantum physicists would refer to as the 0 point field, and it's instant samadhi of the Hindus and the Buddhists. And I'd read about this state, but I didn't think it was anything I could ever experience, because it's the sort of thing that you need to sit on the side of a mountain for 25 years in Tibet, and if you're lucky and you don't die of hypothermia, you will have you will achieve this state of absolute non-duality and union with everything that ever is or has been, and no words can describe that. It is phenomenal, and it's very brief. It only really lasts a few minutes. And what's fascinating about it, I believe, I've read somewhere that it was described as a rehearsal for dying. And that to me makes a lot of sense, because it seems to me that this is the experience we will have, perhaps not as intensely, but at the end of our lives, it's a return to the underlying creative energy that is the source of the manifest universe that we exist in. And you're returned there, and you enter a place that is absolutely timeless and spaceless, which is an extraordinary thing to try and get your head around. I've never intellectually managed to get my head around the idea of place where time doesn't exist. And of course, you become pure being. It's not even consciousness. So you don't know until you come back. And this is the marvelous thing about it, is that as you come back, you realize that you've died and you've come back again, and you know where you've been and you know what you've experienced. And I came back, and many other people do, howling, weeping, laughing like a lunatic. You will hear, if you look see videos online of people experiencing, shouting, just, this is it, oh my God. It is the most powerful experience a person, I believe, could possibly have, and I couldn't have ever imagined anything so powerful. Again, we have to say, you know, research, anyone who's thinking of experiencing this, research very, very carefully, because it's profoundly, profoundly powerful. You don't want to be doing this in a situation on your own, or where you're not, because you're very vulnerable at the time, because you've left, well, you don't leave your body's still there, but there's an absolute breakdown of the reality we know. So you're extremely vulnerable at that point. But again, there's a lot of research being done into this substance worldwide, all across South America and in the US, for treating addictions, particularly, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's something that, researched properly and thoroughly and responsibly, could have tremendous benefits for humankind, essentially. But it is a realization that of the union with the totality of complete non-duality, union with God, if you like. It's a profoundly spiritual experience that I still, sometimes when I meditate and I think about it, so I've only done it 3 times, and I don't feel any need to, to the present time, to do it again. But when I meditate on it and think about it, I just get these wow moments of, my God, that was absolutely extraordinary, beyond anything you could imagine. And as you know, Martin Ball has written a lot about it. James Orrock, who really is the granddaddy of 5-MeO, has written a wonderful book called Tryptamine Palace, which, if anyone wants to know more, I'd strongly recommend reading him or Martin Ball to find out more. James was the first Westerner, in my experience, to introduce it to popular culture here. And he writes very, very expertly about it. Yeah, I don't know what else I can say. I'm sort of speechless, really, when I try to
I think you put that together perfectly. To be honest, I mean, because you're trying to describe the ineffable, aren't you?
Absolutely.
And as Martin so accurately terms it, it's the entheogens. It's literally to find the God within, and that, to me, your description there, the way you describe it, I think speaks volumes. Well, Martin, thank you very much for spending an hour with us. It's been really fascinating. As always, we have just scratched the surface. And as we discussed earlier, we would fill the hour, and we definitely have done so. So if anybody's interested in your work, how can they contact you, or how can they get hold of your books and everything else? So,
well, my books presently are available in ebook. Well, actually, some of them are ebook format, some of them are ebook and paperback, and they're exclusively through Amazon. I will be getting the others into paperback and also audiobooks in time. If anybody would like to buy them, then they can find them on Amazon, Martin Ash page. You can contact me if anybody wants to. Love to hear from you. On Facebook, I've actually got 2 Facebook Martin Ash pages. I don't know why. I only intended to get one, but I've got Martin Ash Author is one of them, and Martin Ash Bloke is another one. I've also got a website which should be ready this week. It should be ready to be published, to launch this week. So there will be, and the address for that is martin-ash.com. It's Martin with a hyphen, Ash. That should be up sometime this coming week. So I think by the time this goes online, it may well be up there. And there is a contact page on there where anybody who would like to can get in touch. And I'd be delighted to hear from them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I mean, as always, I always enjoy talking to you. We've had some fascinating discussions over the last few years, and we will continue having these discussions as well. Right, everybody, thanks again for joining us for this. The next guest we've got is somebody who will probably be able to drill into these areas a little bit more. It's Professor, or definitely Dr. Julia Mossbridge, who is a physicist working with ions. And she's written a series of absolutely fascinating books on quantum physics and consciousness. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion as well. So thanks again. And again, as always, thank you for Dia in the background there, who's cooking very, very slowly over there in Denver. So thanks again, and we'll be chatting with you again soon. Thanks, Martin. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.